Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the resurrection accounts in the Bible. We have just looked at the two from the Old Testament, one from Elijah, one from Elisha. And we've been talking throughout about how these resurrection events all connect to each other and interlock, as it were, in terms of their detail. We saw Elijah and Elisha both precede the resurrection miracles with a miracle of provision, providing oil and flour to the widow of Zarephath, and then providing oil to the widow of one of the sons of the prophets. We saw in both accounts children return to their mothers, sons return to their mothers. We saw in both accounts this happening in an upper room. So this first resurrection event in the life of Jesus follows along that some of those patterns. This is a son being returned to his mother. It doesn't happen upstairs. It happens out in the open country outside the city, but it is very much in keeping with the two resurrection events that we have already read. Jesus performs more miracles than anyone in the Bible, of course, but the person who performs the second most number of miracles in the Bible is Elisha. The person who records the most resurrection events in the Bible is Luke, because he records 3. He records this one, and this is unique to Luke. The raising of the widow of Nain's son doesn't occur in any of the other Gospels. The raising of Jairus' daughter takes place in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. But he also records the ones of Peter and of Paul in the book of Acts. So he records 3 of the 7. And we're going to see Luke's hand, Luke's style in the reporting of this. And it is a very short and very simple narrative, shorter and simpler than the last 2 that we read. Really, it's not the shortest and the simplest. Eutychus' resurrection is, but next to that, this one is the shortest and the simplest resurrection event. The disciples of John reported these things to him. Excuse me, I went ahead a little far. Verse 11, I was reading verse 18. It came about soon afterwards that he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large multitude. So this isn't a private event, this is a major event. Now as he approached the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her, and he said, "Don't cry." And he came up, and he touched the coffin, and he said to the bearer, and the bearers came to a halt, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. And fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report concerning him went out all over Judea and in all the surrounding district. Okay, so Jesus is coming into the city of Nain. He's not preaching in all the villages and cities in Capernaum. The city of Nain lies near the Sea of Galilee, very close to the Sea of Galilee. It is about 25 miles south of Capernaum. And so he's coming into the city. He has a huge crowd with him. And as he's getting ready to enter the city gate, which would not have been that big, there was a crowd of people coming out of the city gate. So we have kind of a traffic jam. We have these two crowds meeting. And so lots of people, you have to envision lots of people there. And the one crowd going out, it's a funeral procession. When I used to live in Ohio, if you saw cars coming to the cemetery in a funeral procession, everyone pulled off to the side of the road until they passed. It was just custom, and it was just politeness. In Jesus' day, if you saw a funeral procession, you were supposed to join it, and walk with the family out to the site of burial. He would have just died. You should have been buried within 24 hours. He was a man, but he was a very young man, probably because there's no widow. And I mean, he doesn't have a widow. He has a mother. The mother's the one leading the procession. So he's a very young man. She has no other male relative, which puts her absolutely at risk and destitute in their society. To not have a male relative to take responsibility for her and to care for her and protect her. And so her loss is really unimaginable. And so Jesus feels compassion for her. He says, "Don't cry." And he feels compassion for her. We see Jesus in all four Gospels, and we see Jesus in the resurrection events being four times in the three resurrection events, being the guy who comes to the aid of a woman in distress. And he does that here. Jesus is always doing that. So let's notice this. Let's also notice that of the 13 times that Jesus' emotional motivation is mentioned, 12 of those times his motivation is compassion. Splagne, which means to feel something viscerally, literally to feel it in your gut. It's an impulse. It's the impulse to just help someone who needs help, the impulse to do something when you can. And that's what motivates Jesus. And he says, "Don't cry." And they're evidently still kind of pushed through the crowd. Time is of the essence. You're not allowed to leave a body. They have to get, and Jesus puts his hand on it says here, the coffin. It would not have been a pine box like we'd think of. He'd have been wrapped up in some way and then buried, in a much the way Jesus will be later, in a tomb, in a cave tomb or something like that. But it would have been on a plank, and the body would have been wrapped up mummy-like. So he puts his hand on this. Now, according to the Old Testament, according to Numbers chapter 9, this is about as unclean thing as you can do. But he does it anyway. And he says, "Young man, I say to you, arise, get up." He doesn't have to pray to God to do it. He doesn't. He just does it. And that's the difference. That's the pattern disrupted, because Jesus is God. And everyone in that crowd, their immediate reaction is not joy, it's fear, because of their faith, because they know they're in the presence of greatness. They don't call him the Messiah. They call him a great prophet, someone who goes even beyond Elijah and Elisha, because he doesn't have to ask God to do it. He just does it. And they understand this as the work of God. God has visited his people, and the word spread everywhere. And so we're back to the pattern. It produces faith. But this is not a private event. This is a public event. This is a public event. We're going to talk about Jairus' daughter. We're going to take a couple of sessions to do that. That is, in its own way, a very public event, as will be the raising of Lazarus, a very public event. And we'll start talking about the Jairus' daughter next time. And we're going to primarily look at that from Mark's Gospel. We'll pick up there when we're together next time. Thank you for joining me for 5 good minutes with the Word.